I wanted to keep them with me. I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons.
The trial ends, and the headlines fade. But the story of these infamous killers continue, this time behind the bars. Some unexpectedly lived a calm and peaceful prison life. Others made a chaotic rebellion. Others we will unfold in this video. Prison life may have taken away, but not their breath. These most talked about killers have an equally intense and controversial prison life, just like their unimaginable crimes. Let's find out how they coped and lived after the world stopped watching. Number 10. Chris Watts. Let's begin with the person who is automatically hated by almost everyone once they begin learning his crime. Chris Watts, the man who shocked the world by killing his pregnant wife, Shanann, and their two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, in 2018, has been serving multiple life sentences at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Since his arrest and shocking confession, Watts's prison life has been pretty low-key compared to some other infamous criminals, but it's definitely far from easy or peaceful. He's housed in a maximum security prison, which is standard for someone convicted of such brutal crimes. Because of the intense media attention and the nature of his offenses, Watts is kept separated from the general prison population for his own safety. You can imagine that other inmates wouldn't exactly be welcoming to someone who killed their own family in such a horrifying way. In prison, Watts reportedly keeps a low profile. Unlike some notorious killers who try to stir up trouble or gain attention, he seems quiet and withdrawn. Sources say he spends most of his time alone or in small groups, avoiding conflict as much as possible. His demeanor before his sentencing already gave off a cold and detached vibe, and that same vibe seems to follow him behind bars. Watts doesn't have the kind of personality that would make him popular in prison, but he also isn't known for causing any major problems. Still, being behind bars means living under constant surveillance, with limited freedom and very little privacy. It's a far cry from the life he had before, a grim punishment that matches the severity of his crimes. One interesting aspect of Watts's prison journey is how quickly he accepted a plea deal that gave him multiple life sentences without any chance of parole. This deal helped him avoid the death penalty, which many people saw as a relief, considering how emotionally charged his case was. Some speculate that he took the deal to skip a long, painful trial and avoid further public scrutiny. Others think maybe he finally grasped the full weight of what he had done and accepted that life in prison was his only option. Either way, this choice means Watts is likely to spend the rest of his life behind bars, with little hope of ever being free. Unlike killers such as Charles Manson or Ted Bundy, Watts hasn't sought fame or public attention while in prison. There are no reports of him giving interviews, writing letters to fans, or trying to manipulate the media. In fact, he seems to want to disappear into the background and stay as unnoticed as possible. Whether that's out of fear, shame, or just a desire for self-preservation is unclear, but it's a sharp contrast to some other high-profile criminals who thrive on attention. Life in prison is structured and monotonous. Watts's days probably involve waking up early, eating bland meals, doing assigned chores or work, and limited recreational time. He's under strict rules and constant watch, with very little personal freedom. Given the nature of his crimes, he's likely subject to extra caution from prison staff, and his interactions with other inmates are probably closely monitored to prevent conflicts. Prison can be a lonely and harsh environment, especially for someone like Watts, who carries the heavy burden of guilt and public hate. Chris Watts's prison life is a quiet but grim chapter in a tragic story. From being a seemingly normal family man to becoming one of the most reviled criminals in recent memory, his life behind bars reflects the consequences of his horrific actions. Number 9. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, didn't exactly live a quiet life behind bars. After his final arrest in 1978, Bundy was shuffled around different prisons before ending up on death row at Florida State Prison. You'd think someone like him would fade into the background, but Bundy being Bundy, he kept making headlines even in prison. He tried to manipulate the system, delay his execution, and maintain some weird sense of control, even from a prison cell. Bundy wasn't your typical inmate. For one, he acted like he was smarter than everyone around him. He spent a lot of time reading law books and even tried to represent himself in court. In prison, he continued this routine, filing appeals and studying legal documents, all in an attempt to avoid the electric chair. He also gave tons of interviews, especially toward the end of his life. In a way, he seemed to enjoy the attention, like he couldn't stand not being in the spotlight. Another weird part of Bundy's prison life was his relationships. While on death row, he got married to a woman named Carol Ann Boone, right in the courtroom during his trial. It was all part of some legal loophole, and somehow it worked. The two even had a daughter together, allegedly conceived during a prison visit. It's bizarre to think about. Here's this guy convicted of horrible crimes, and yet he's living out some twisted version of family life behind bars. Even in his final days, Bundy tried to stay in control. As his execution date came closer, he started confessing to more killings, maybe hoping to delay the inevitable. He played this cat-and-mouse game with investigators, giving them just enough information to keep their interest. But in the end, it didn't save him. On January 24, 1989, he was executed in the electric chair. Crowds actually gathered outside the prison, cheering and holding signs that said things like, "Burn, Bundy, burn." Ted Bundy's prison life was anything but normal. He used every trick he could to delay his execution and keep himself in the media. From his courtroom marriage to last-minute confessions, he stayed manipulative until the very end. In a twisted way, he turned his prison sentence into another stage to perform on, and that's what made him so chilling. Remember Dahmer? Not many people know about what happened to him in prison. Get ready to be surprised by his fate. Number 8. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer's prison life was just as disturbing and complicated as the crimes that got him locked up in the first place. After being sentenced to multiple life terms in 1992 for killing and dismembering 17 young men and boys, Dahmer was sent to Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. At first, he was kept in protective custody, basically isolation, because prison officials figured other inmates wouldn't exactly welcome a serial killer, especially one whose crimes were as gruesome and high-profile as his. Eventually, though, Dahmer asked to be moved into the general population, saying he wanted to be around people and take on regular prison duties. Surprisingly, they allowed it. What's really strange is that Dahmer seemed kind of laid back in prison, at least on the surface. He reportedly got along with guards, read the Bible, and even joked about his crimes in a really dark, inappropriate way. Some inmates said he would shape his food into fake body parts and pour ketchup on them to mess with people. It was like he couldn't help himself from being disturbing, even behind bars. He also started claiming he had found religion and had been baptized, which made some people think he was trying to redeem himself, though others weren't buying it at all. Dahmer's prison life came to an abrupt and violent end in 1994, just a couple years after he got there. He was beaten to death by another inmate, Christopher Scarver, while doing a cleaning detail. Scarver later said he killed Dahmer because he was sick of his creepy jokes and felt he wasn't truly remorseful. Some people believe the guards may have purposely left them alone together, knowing something might happen. Whether or not that's true, one thing is for sure. Dahmer's time in prison didn't last long and definitely wasn't peaceful. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer's prison life was like everything else about him: unsettling, confusing, and surrounded by controversy. Even behind bars, he managed to freak people out, spark debate, and meet a violent end. It was a grim conclusion to a terrifying story. Number 7. The Killer Clown. John Wayne Gacy, the so-called Killer Clown, lived a pretty bizarre prison life after being convicted of killing 33 young men and boys. After his arrest and trial in 1980, he was sent to Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, where he spent 14 years on death row. You might expect someone in his position to spend that time quietly fading into the background, but Gacy wasn't that type. Instead, he stayed active. If anything, he treated prison like his own twisted version of a business office. One of the strangest parts of Gacy's time in prison was his painting. Yep, the guy took up art and started painting non-stop: clowns, skulls, portraits, and weird abstract stuff. He actually sold his artwork to collectors outside of prison, and some of it went for thousands of dollars. It sounds unbelievable, but people were fascinated with him, and he knew how to use that attention. In a way, he was still performing, just like he did when he used to dress up as Pogo the Clown at parties. Gacy also gave tons of interviews while locked up. He always claimed he was innocent and that the media had twisted everything. He even said the police planted evidence, which is hard to take seriously considering they found bodies buried under his house. Still, he never admitted guilt and stayed pretty cold and emotionless whenever he talked about the crimes or denied them. He also kept filing appeals to avoid the death penalty, but none of them worked out in the end. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Reports say his last meal was fried chicken, shrimp, and strawberries, strangely casual for a man who caused so much horror. His final words were supposedly, "Kiss my ass," which pretty much sums up the defiant attitude he carried all the way to the end. Gacy's prison life was a mix of denial, manipulation, and weird self-promotion, proving that even behind bars, he couldn't stop trying to control the narrative. Number 6. The Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez, famously known as the Night Stalker, earned one of the creepiest and most chilling reputations of any serial killer in American history. And his life in prison didn't soften that dark image one bit. After his capture in 1985, Ramirez was convicted of 13 killings, along with a slew of other violent crimes, including sexual assault and burglary. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison in California, a place notorious for housing some of the state's most dangerous criminals. You might think that a guy like Ramirez would keep his head down and try to avoid attention behind bars, but that wasn't the case. Even in prison, with no freedom to roam, he managed to maintain the unsettling aura that terrified many outside. During his time on death row, Ramirez became something of a dark celebrity. It's kind of surreal when you think about it. He received tons of fan mail, including letters and gifts from people who were oddly fascinated by him. Some women, in particular, developed a strange obsession, idolizing the man behind the horrific crimes. The most shocking part? Ramirez actually got married while in prison in 1996 to one of these admirers, Doreen Leoy. She insisted that he was innocent, despite overwhelming evidence and his own terrifying behavior. This bizarre phenomenon highlights how twisted charisma and mystery can sometimes draw people toward even the most dangerous individuals. Ramirez carried this strange magnetism, mixing menace with a kind of dark allure that fascinated the public and the media alike. Personality-wise, Ramirez stayed pretty much the same in prison as he was outside: cold, creepy, and unapologetically sinister. He showed no signs of remorse or guilt for the crimes that had earned him the death penalty. During his trial, one of the most memorable moments was when he flashed a pentagram he had drawn on his palm and shouted, "Hail Satan," cementing his image as a figure of evil in the public eye. That same aura followed him behind bars. While Ramirez wasn't necessarily involved in prison riots or constant drama, he was known to be a loner who kept to himself, maintaining his eerie and intimidating presence. He didn't make friends easily, and was often viewed with a mix of fear and curiosity by other inmates. Like many death row inmates in California, Ramirez spent decades waiting for execution. The legal system's delays meant that he remained in that high-security prison cell for over 23 years, enduring the slow and isolating grind of life on death row. Death row is a harsh, lonely environment with extreme restrictions. Most inmates spend about 23 hours a day locked up, with very limited contact with others. Ramirez never faced the electric chair or lethal injection. Instead, he died in 2013 from complications related to B-cell lymphoma, a form of cancer. His death in prison marked the end of a life that was as disturbing behind bars as it was outside them. His prison years didn't erase the terror he caused. If anything, his continued dark presence behind bars added to the strange fascination that surrounded him. We've been talking about male criminals. You wouldn't expect a woman in the list. It's time to talk about Aileen and prison life. Number 5, the female serial killer. Aileen Wuornos, often called America's first female serial killer, had a prison life that was just as chaotic and emotionally intense as her time on the outside. After being convicted of killing 7 men between 1989 and 90, she was sentenced to death and locked up at the Florida Department of Corrections. From the beginning, Wuornos stood out, not just because she was a woman on death row, which is rare, but because of her unpredictable behavior, emotional outbursts, and complex personality. She wasn't quiet or reserved like some other high-profile inmates. She was vocal, angry, and didn't hold back. During her time in prison, Aileen gave several interviews and became something of a media fascination. Documentaries were made about her, and she often used these interviews to vent her frustrations about the legal system, the people around her, and the world in general. Over time, she grew more paranoid, convinced that the guards were trying to poison her food and torture her psychologically. Whether those claims were true or just the result of stress and mental illness is up for debate. But it was clear that Wuornos was struggling. She often came off as someone who had been through too much and didn't trust anyone anymore. What's especially sad about Wuornos's prison life is how isolated she became. She didn't have many visitors, and her only real consistent contact seemed to be through interviews or legal meetings. In 2002, she actually asked the court to stop all appeals and let her be executed, saying she was ready to die and tired of what she called being tortured in prison. That request was granted, and she was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Her last words were famously strange. "I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus June 6th. It was classic Aileen, intense, mysterious, and emotionally raw until the very end. She never found peace, and whether people saw her as a monster or a damaged woman pushed over the edge, her time on death row was a haunting final chapter in a very troubled life. Number 4. Dennis Rader's prison life. Dennis Rader, better known as the BTK killer, short for bind, torture, kill, has been serving 10 life sentences at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas since his arrest in 2005. Unlike many serial killers who crave the spotlight or cause chaos in court, Rader's prison life has been surprisingly quiet. But that calm is what makes it so unsettling. Before his capture, Rader managed to live a disturbing double life. A seemingly normal, church-going family man and a responsible city employee who volunteered in his community. This chilling contrast between his public persona and his dark crimes made his arrest all the more shocking. Once behind bars, that carefully constructed mask completely fell away, revealing a cold, calculating mind underneath. Still, in prison, he's taken on the role of a model inmate, following rules and keeping a low profile, an eerie normalcy that somehow makes him even creepier. Because of the severity of his crimes and the notoriety he carries, Rader isn't placed in the general prison population. He's confined to solitary lockdown for 23 hours each day, with very limited interaction with other inmates. This extreme isolation means most of his time is spent alone in his cell, with just 1 hour a day allowed for exercise, usually in a small, enclosed outdoor space by himself. This kind of confinement might break many people, but Rader has adjusted to it in his own twisted way. Despite being locked away and isolated, he hasn't completely vanished from the outside world. Rader keeps communication channels open with some true crime authors and even criminology students, responding to their letters with unnerving detail. In these letters, he sometimes describes his crimes in a disturbingly casual or even bragging tone, showing little remorse or emotional depth. What's particularly strange about Rader's prison life is his willingness to engage with law enforcement and mental health professionals who study him. He has cooperated extensively with psychologists and criminal profilers, helping them understand how someone could live such a dark double life for decades without raising suspicion. Some experts believe this cooperation is his way of staying relevant or feeding his ego, while others think he genuinely wants to contribute to criminal science in a bizarre sense of purpose. Whatever the reason, it's clear that Rader remains manipulative and self-absorbed, traits that certainly didn't disappear after his arrest or incarceration. He's maintained control over his narrative, choosing when and how to communicate, always calculating the impact of his words. Unlike some infamous killers who bring chaos, violence, or outbursts into prison, Rader's time behind bars is marked by a disturbing quietness. He's compliant, cooperative, and outwardly normal. But that normalcy only adds to the horror of who he really is. The man who terrorized Wichita for decades lives behind concrete walls and iron bars, wearing a different mask now. His prison life is another carefully crafted performance, a continuation of his ability to deceive and manipulate, even in captivity. While he may be physically confined, mentally and emotionally, Dennis Rader remains just as twisted and dangerous as ever. Number 3. Albert Fish. Albert Fish, one of the most disturbing and twisted criminals in American history, didn't spend a super long time in prison, but the time he did serve was just as bizarre as the rest of his life. After being arrested in 1934 for the kidnapping and killings of a young girl named Grace Budd, Fish confessed to crimes that were so shocking, even seasoned detectives were horrified. His trial in 1935 was a media circus, mostly because of the creepy and graphic details of what he had done. People couldn't believe that this quiet, elderly man with a soft voice had committed such horrifying acts. Once he was found guilty, he was sent to Sing Sing Prison in New York to await execution. Fish's prison life was surprisingly calm, which is honestly pretty unsettling considering everything he had done. He didn't cause any trouble, He cooperated with the guards, and he spent most of his time writing letters or talking about his crimes like he was reading from a script. He even described his actions in cold, emotionless detail, like it was just another story. What made it weirder was that he seemed totally at peace with the idea of dying. He wasn't scared, he wasn't angry. He actually looked forward to the electric chair, calling it the supreme thrill. Yeah, creepy. He didn't have many visitors in prison, and most people wanted nothing to do with him. Some doctors and psychologists were interested in studying him because he was such a strange and extreme case, but other than that, he was mostly left alone. Fish even wrote a final statement before his execution that was apparently so disturbing, authorities refused to release it to the public. That says a lot, especially coming from a case already filled with horror. Albert Fish was executed on January 16, 1936. When they flipped the switch on the electric chair, it actually short-circuited because of the metal pins and needles he had inserted into his own body over the years, something he had confessed to during his trial. In the end, his prison life was eerily quiet for someone who had committed such monstrous crimes. No drama, no outbursts, just a disturbing calm before the final act. We're down to the last two, but it doesn't mean men committed the least crimes. In fact, wait until we expose Manson's then prison condition. Number 2. Ed Gein. Ed Gein, the man who inspired horror movie icons like Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill, actually lived a surprisingly quiet life behind bars after his arrest in 1957. When police searched his Wisconsin farmhouse, they found a nightmare scene: furniture made from human bones and skin, masks made of faces, and even a belt made of nipples. But despite all that horror, Gein wasn't your typical raging serial killer. In fact, he only confirmed 2 killings and mostly robbed graves. He was declared legally insane and sent to a mental institution instead of a regular prison. Gein spent the rest of his life at the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Wisconsin and later at the Mendota Mental Health Institute. His time there was pretty uneventful, especially considering the crimes that landed him there. He was quiet, polite, and generally well-behaved. Some of the staff said he was friendly and easy to manage, as long as you didn't think too hard about what he'd done. He spent his days reading, doing chores, and apparently loved discussing old detective stories and true crime cases, which is ironic, to say the least. He didn't get a lot of visitors, but he did gain a strange kind of fame. Over the years, true crime fans and horror buffs became obsessed with him, and even though he was locked away, he became a creepy pop culture figure. Gein never really showed much emotion or remorse about what he did. He just sort of existed in his own strange world, detached from the horror he'd caused. Ed Gein died in 1984 from cancer, after spending more than 30 years in institutional care. His prison life was quiet, controlled, and disturbingly normal for someone whose crimes were anything but. In a way, the calmness of his later years only adds to the eerie legend of a man who did terrible things, but seemed to live out his days like an average patient in a hospital for the insane. Number 1. Charles Manson. Charles Manson is one of the most infamous criminals in American history, not because he personally committed all the killings he was connected to, but because of his role as the manipulative cult leader behind the brutal Tate LaBianca killings in 1969. After his conviction in 1971, Manson was sent to Corcoran State Prison in California, where he spent over 4 decades locked up. His prison life was anything but boring. He was a larger-than-life character who continued to make headlines and stir controversy even behind bars. Manson wasn't the kind of guy who followed the rules quietly. Right from the start, he was known for being rebellious and unpredictable. He got into fights with other inmates and prison staff, and he was often put into solitary confinement as a result. At times, he'd try to take control or influence other prisoners, acting like the same cult leader he was on the outside. Even though he was confined, he didn't lose his ability to be manipulative or disruptive. In fact, prison became almost like a new stage for his twisted charisma. One of the more bizarre parts of Manson's prison life was how he kept attracting a strange kind of fame. Over the years, he received tons of fan mail, including letters from people who believed in him or were fascinated by his story. He even had followers who showed up at his parole hearings or wrote to him regularly, almost like he was some kind of rock star behind bars. This weird cult of personality helped keep his name in the public eye, even though he was locked away and couldn't physically cause any more harm. Manson also gave interviews and made public statements that were often rambling, cryptic, and disturbing. He talked about conspiracy theories, claimed to be some kind of messiah or prophet, and sometimes hinted at secrets or hidden knowledge that only he understood. Prison didn't seem to soften his wild ideas. If anything, it made them more intense. He seemed to enjoy the attention and used every chance to keep his infamy alive. Sometimes, he'd appear on camera with that trademark creepy smile, talking about everything from politics to pop culture in a way that left people feeling uneasy. Over the years, Manson was moved between different prisons, but he always stayed in high-security facilities because of the danger he posed and the notoriety he carried. For a long time, he was on death row, but after California temporarily halted the death penalty in the 70s, his sentence was changed to life imprisonment. Despite that, he never stopped fighting the system or trying to assert his control in some way. He filed appeals, wrote letters, and remained a headache for prison officials who had to deal with his unpredictable behavior. Charles Manson's prison life came to an end in 2017 when he died of natural causes at the age of 83. Looking back, his time behind bars was a strange mix of chaos and routine, notoriety and isolation. Even though he was locked up for decades, he never really lost the ability to shock, manipulate, or fascinate people. His life in prison was a reflection of the man himself, dark, disturbing, and impossible to ignore. Do you know more infamous killers? Share your insights in the comments section and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more.